started by looking at international relations. And yeah, it was a great experience because it was a project that we work on from kind of drafting an idea into a project that could be doable, to kind of realizing why are we doing it, who are we including it, why are we including these people and not other people, what is the best way to kind of engage in a project that is more collaborative, and we are taking into account different stakeholders kind of positionalities and opinions. And I think it was the first time that I actually had a project in my hands that I could see how it evolved, and this constant reshaping was very rewarding for me, because it showed me that there are critical parts during a research project where you can actively make the decision to not continue with these oppressive practices. And I don't think that maybe I would have realized about these critical moments where you actually have the power to decide how you engage in research and why, if I hadn't had the opportunity to study this while the Emerging Researchers Program. And and I firmly believe back then, and I do now, that that experience that I had was going to come in handy and help me to grow personally and professionally. And I'm very happy to say that it has. Like now I'm working as a business and human rights consultant for a NGO that is called Stop the Traffik, and they work with governments and private and public companies, organizations, to look at the ways in which we can reduce modern slavery-related practices and human trafficking. We specifically look at labor exploitation, for example. And here I have to manage these projects in regards to what we tell to our clients, I suppose. And I have realized that I also have these moments in which I can decide, why am I doing the research, who is benefiting from it, why am I including these people and not other people. And it not only helps me to believe that the outcome of the research is valuable to the people that I'm working with, which obviously is like the centerpiece of why I think we should do research, but also personally it helps me to feel a little bit more like calm and just happy, that I'm doing a research where I feel proud of what I'm doing, and I'm trying to not reproduce these practices, and that calmness that it gives to you as a professional and how you work with other people, I think is really valuable if you want to continue down this road. So yeah, I'm very happy. I was very happy to be part of this project, and I'll continue to be. And yeah, that is my experience. That has been my experience. So yeah, I hope that you enjoyed the rest of the panel. And now I'm going to pass over to Bennett, who's going to be moderating the first panel. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Juanita, for your reflection on the program. Yeah, just to kick it off, my name's Bennett Collins. I think that was a really good introduction already, Juanita, to the panel that we're about to begin. Anyway, so I'm a deputy director of the Third Generation Project, so the first panel is titled "The Power of Representation and Narrative." And the three presentations, which is actually an intergenerational mix of emerging researchers, as we have Mathilde from the class of 2020 joining us. And then, we have Akshika and then Kira, Hannah from the class of 2021 presenting. They'll be presenting on a range of topics that intersect with climate change and climate justice education. And I think as we're in the era of disinformation and the 24-hour news cycle, that we are constantly being bombarded with expertise and imagery, and there's very little critical education around how we are to interpret and view all of this information that is coming at us. And I think one of our projects, Breaking the Fourth Wall of Climate Migration, has made the third generation project really center on the power of narrative and imagery, specifically in the classroom, and how we are to interpret when xenophobic images, for example, come across our screens, and how we educate young people to actually filter these out and to identify these when they come across, so that we can build a more inclusive society. So yeah, these three projects will be commenting on the vast spectrum of the topic of narrative and representation. And to just kick it off, I will pass it over to, I believe, Mathilde, you are first on the list. So Mathilde Rose from the class of 2020.
Yeah, thank you, Bennett. Jimmy, are you here for the slides?
Yeah, I'll share the screen now.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so thank you for having me here today. As Juanita, I'm still using my TGP research every day in my work, and yeah, it's great to see how TGP is doing now. And yeah, I'll get started as soon as we're all able to see them. Okay, I can just
give me 1 second. It's just something about privacy issues because it's recording. Whilst it's recording, my laptop's not letting me.
I can try to do it directly. Is this? Are you able to see this?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And are you seeing the slides, or are you seeing the entire window?
We're seeing the entire window.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'll just go with that note. Okay. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for having me here again. So I'm gonna talk about the research I did when I was in TGP up to last year. So the research was called Rewriting Narratives of Addressing Climate Change Using Theatre of the Oppressed, which really practically is about how we can use so this new interpretation of theatre called Theatre of the Oppressed, and how it can be used to support the fight against climate change and to involve more people and make it easier for people to be involved. And in this research, I was especially focused on young people. So I guess to start, just introducing Theatre of the Oppressed. So it was created in the 1960s in Brazil by Augusto Boal, you can see in the top left corner. So it was during the Brazilian dictatorship, and the idea is that Augusto Boal started this kind of new technique after having made a play to a village that was under military occupation and showing on stage to the people, this is what you could be doing, this is how you should revolt. And he was saying at the end of the play, people from the audience went to see him to say, it's very easy for you to be showing us what we should be doing. It's a very easy position for you actors to be on stage playing a revolution. But if we were to do it ourselves, we would probably get killed. And how dare you speak for us? And from this, he started developing a much more participatory take on theatre. And so he sees theatre as a new tool that could be democratized and used by everyone to fight any type of oppression. So it's been developed widely. It's still used nowadays, so 60 years later, on almost every single continent for many different types of oppression. So it's been used for sexism issue, racism, and more recently for climate change. And the type I've been focusing on my research is forum theatre. So you can see an example on the photo in the bottom corner. So it's completely rethinking the idea of having as these really active people on stage in the way, you know, the people who have the knowledge and would be transmitting this knowledge to the spectator in the audience who would remain silent and just have feelings about what's happening on stage, but remain completely passive. And he rethinks that notion and make the audience into what he calls spect actors. And very practically, the audience can interrupt the play and go on stage and replay the scene differently and change what they're saying is not right. So the goal is to be showing very practical grassroots scenes of oppression on stage. So it's not about theories, it's about lived experiences of oppression and replaying the scene and seeing how it could go differently. And especially how the oppressed person in the scene could be changing their reaction and how they could be, you know, fighting against the person oppressing them. And so Boal himself was calling it a rehearsal for revolution. The idea that you're on stage, you practice. And it's not this notion of catharsis. It's not when you step out, you feel better. It's once you've stepped on stage, you feel confident enough that you will also be acting and speaking up on a daily basis. So I guess how is this linked to climate change? So I have a very simple idea. I think we all agree here that climate change is a social justice issue. It's an issue of oppression. It's affecting everyone, but especially affects people already facing some form of oppression. So we've had discussion about, you know, global South country being affected the most, about it's linked to gender, increased gender-based violence, which was also some research at TGP. And on a more practical aspect, it also means we need inclusive and intersectional solutions. And so how do we get more people involved? How are we sure that everyone can have their voice heard? And it doesn't seem to be working, to be waiting to be given a seat at the table and just then be limited by existing institutions. I think we really need this systemic change and grassroots activism. And so my research was also about how do we support this new generation of activists? What makes someone an activist? Well, someone may not feel like they can speak up. So there's a confidence to speak up and building this self-confidence, but there's also what Boal was calling the cop in the head, which other people may link to, like, you know, Foucault's panopticon and stopping oneself from feeling like you can speak up, and why, when you see something that is wrong, why do you just stay silent? And in this, theater of the oppressed can play a really big role of training you in this much more familial, comfortable environment that you can go and speak up and practice and see what works best. So as a very, you know, very practical take on this, so how could educators implement this in the classroom, in workshops? How do we use theater? How do we start it? So the goal is really that it can be used by anyone. It could be, you know, weekly workshop, a few hours every week over a few months with children. It could just be a one-off in afternoon, a weekend program. The length can vary very easily. So the first stage is just really getting used to theater. You can see on the top picture, which is a theater company in the US, which also does theater of the oppressed for climate change. So the first stage is getting used to using your body and your voice in this new way of expressing yourself and doing theater. And then getting started with forum theater. So as we were saying, forum theater is this notion of anyone in the audience can go on stage, but from the very start, it's the audience and the people on stage are just all working together, all part of the same group facing similar oppressions. And they talk together about the play they want to play on stage. And it's very practical topics. So it's always encouraged to represent a theme you've experienced. So for young people and climate change, it could be, you know, some of the plays that have been done are a family conflict. You're at the dinner table with your family and you talk about climate change and your parents laugh at you and say you're too young to be involved in this. And how can young people react and how can they feel more confident? You can have issues of sexism and racism in climate activism that could make people feel excluded. or wanting to have more of a say in school decision and local politics. So it's really training young people to go on stage. And what you can see in the bottom is an example of the person on the right playing a businessman trying to buy some land in Africa and be building, I think it was about building a new road, and then the villager on the right playing the response to the businessman. And what was really interesting is that anyone can interrupt the villager and go take their place and say, oh, you think this, but what I lived myself as someone who has faced this type of oppression was this issue, and this is how I think we could face it. So for young people, it can be a really good practice to have this opportunity to, do this rehearsal for revolution. So you go on stage, you change the play, you change how you would react and speak to your family, with truly the goal that once you step out of the stage, you have built this feeling that you can do it. And so, yeah, just to conclude, some really practical resources. So if you want to get started, I think Augusto Boal's books are amazing, very practical, very based on his own experience of traveling the world to do these workshops. So Games for Actors and Non-Actors is one of the most approachable one. You have some academic research, maybe the policy briefs were written will be shared at the end. Facebook groups where some of the leading practitioners are really active and are just willing to include anyone. And yes, some organizations. And I guess feel free to mail me if you have any question. So yeah, that was all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathilde. That was brilliant. If you actually could put your email in the chat, that would be great if people
Sure.
wanted to send you an email. Yeah, just for a little housekeeping message. So we'll do the Q&A part at the end. So we'll have all the panelists present and then we'll do Q&As. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat for the presenters. And I think also it should be noted that the Emerging Researchers Program, we've been tussling about kind of the final projects over the past few years of doing the Emerging Researchers. It was at first kind of assisting us with our own projects, and then it became doing their own Emerging Researchers completing their own research projects and what those outputs would look like. So Mathilde's class did policy briefs, and the 2021 class onwards are now doing visual posters and kind of audio podcasts, that all of which we'll be putting up on our website. So yeah, please keep your eye on our website for those, and we'll definitely send the link around to all participants once we have those up. Just keeping the flow going. Next we have Hannah Weir from the class of 2021.
Great, so I'm going to try to share as well. Yeah. Okay. Oh. It's just loading.
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, it's the whole screen that you can see.
We just see your slides taking the whole space.
Okay, perfect. So going off of Mathilde's presentation, I focused on fiction as a way of exploring themes of migration, home identity and language, and I was interested in the idea that there are all of these questions that are being raised in migration studies, questions like, how do people remember their homes? How do memories of home affect their identity, that are explored through ethnographic research in anthropology and in IR. And I wanted to take these questions posed by scholars and attempt to answer them using fiction written by immigrants as primary sources, as opposed to ethnographies done by academics, and to see what sort of information that yields and what kind of opportunities that opens up for scholarship to be expanded. I also came to St. Andrews as an English student, so I think I had a particular interest in fiction as a way of addressing political issues, and I think that it has a lot of potential, and I wanted to explore that in my project. So I started with the idea that home is an ambivalent term that is twisted and reshaped through the act of migration, and I wanted to explore how immigrant authors write about their diaspora, finding home in America. So each of the authors in the books that I looked at were written by authors who either migrated in their lifetime or their parents migrated, and then all of the characters, their protagonists and secondary characters, etc., are also split between locations. And so, can you see the next slide now? Yes.
Yes.
So, yeah, to answer the question, why fiction? I'm interested in fiction because of its capacity to reach diverse and expansive audiences. I think that something that we talked about quite a lot in the Emerging Researcher program is how inaccessible academic writing is, because it's expensive, because the words are big and complicated, and because of its size and how self-referential it is. And so if you just read one piece of academic text, it can sometimes just, even if you had the money to read it, even if you had the time, not make any sense. And I was interested in the fact that lots of people read books. People read bestseller books. People read books to escape for all kinds of reasons. And so how can storytelling be a political tool to create space and declare identity? And as we discussed quite a lot in, our program, but also in critical theory classes that I've taken in IR, language wields power, and narrative frameworks do enormous work to forge national ideologies, normalize behaviors, create trope identities, and center certain perspectives while erasing others. All of these things are, of course, essential to the act of telling a story in fiction as well as in histories. So that's why I was interested in fiction. So I picked 3 books to focus my research on for the sake of the scale of the project. And so the first book was Drown by Junot Diaz. And Drown is a collection of short stories narrated by a revolving cast of characters who are all young Latino men who are from the Dominican Republic, who live either in the Dominican Republic or in New Jersey, which is Junot Diaz's own personal story. And then the second book I chose is The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. And this novel is often read by like 12 to 15-year-olds. It's very, very easy to read and very short. And it's composed of a series of vignettes that follow a year in the life of Esperanza, a 12-year-old Chicana girl growing up in Chicago. And throughout the book, Esperanza writes about home because she lives in a house in Mango Street, and the vignettes are just about walking around the neighborhood and her life and from the day to day. And the third thing I chose is not a book but a short story called Seven, written by Edwidge Danticat, who is a Haitian immigrant who moved to New York City and now writes fiction about Haitian characters. And in this short story, a husband and wife are reunited after spending 7 years apart, the husband living and working 2 jobs in New York City and the wife staying behind in Haiti. So I did an analysis of each of these 3 books and the ways that they can be compared and contrasted and what we can learn from them. And I'm going to summarize what I found. Because it hit on the 3 themes of home, identity, and language. And the first thing that came up quite a lot is that there's home in these three novels, the characters were finding home in hybridity, which means, how do you describe home when you're from two places? How do you describe who you are when you use two languages to speak? And so all of the books had multiple languages and multiple linguistic registers. You know, how do you speak to your grandma in Spanglish as opposed to how do you speak to your friends, you know, when you go down the street to like explore the neighborhood. And so there's quite a lot of hybridity that makes up the sense of home that the characters find. And I wanted to share a quote from Gloria Anzaldúa, who's a Chicana feminist poet and scholar, and she writes that ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. She says, "I am my language. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. Until I can accept as legitimate Chicana, Texas, Spanish, Tex-Mex, and all the other languages I speak, I cannot accept the legitimacy of myself." And I think that it is because of authors like Anzaldúa that I realized what political potential these ideas of fiction, how fiction can be used as a tool in the classroom. So if a student reads a book that suddenly includes the voices of people who sound like them, who have not been invited into mainstream conversations before, it can have quite a liberating effect on children and on, people who are excluded from linguistic margins, which hits on the second point, that the authors and the narrators of the stories were declaring their identity through the act of telling a story, which is, of course, a political act, because to make a declaration of truth or to take up space even in the act of telling a story is political. And I think that has a lot of ramifications for how books can be used in educating and in allowing people space to be themselves. And then the final thing is the role that memory plays, because in all of the stories, the characters are remembering the past lives and where they used to live and the people they used to be and the languages they used to speak, because in none of the books do they fully speak Spanish or do they fully speak Creole or French. They speak a hybrid of the two. And this is something that came up over and over again in the migration studies that I did more formally in IR, is how memory is a tool that is used out of necessity to escape the present, which can be a very exclusionary place, and return to another more idyllic, comfortable place, which is where you used to be or who you used to be. So yeah, to conclude, I want to hit on the point that I think this research, though I contained it quite finely within my own academic research in the university, I think that it can be applied beyond the university in classroom settings of middle school and high schoolers. And I focused on authors that are American and who write about American stories of migration. But I think that these aren't the only books about migration, and they aren't the only books that are written to a reading level of 10 to 15-year-olds who could be assigned texts in classrooms. And I think that the project opened up my eyes to the potential of fiction to do this work and to start these conversations within classrooms.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was another fascinating presentation. And I think it just kind of shows the breadth of, of what the topic of climate justice education can include. And I really like so far that the presentations have been more leaning towards pedagogy in a way. But I think we're going to shift with Akshika's presentation and turn towards climate politics in a more practical sense. So Akshika, when you're ready.
Yep, I'll just share my screen. Is this showing?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to say, like, very briefly about in the Emerging Researchers Program. I'm really happy that I've been involved in it. It's really given me so many skills that I carry with me when I examine things every day, from things to being able to listen to people's stories, and when I read academic articles, the skills and the questioning and the critical skills that I've learned from the Emerging Researchers Program, I really carry that with me. So yeah, and I really enjoyed the presentations before as well. So I'm going to talk about representation and climate change. I'm going to talk about the main issues and the causes, and a few solutions that I think could practically work, because representation is the more practical form of getting justice started. And yeah, so kind of to summarize what I'm about to go into is this question, which is, how can someone less likely to be immediately impacted by climate change make decisions regarding preventative measures in the same way as someone who would be directly affected? So basically that really accounts to, if you've experienced something, you have more of the knowledge to kind of solve that issue because you have that direct experience, and which is very valuable in solving the issue because, again, you're directly affected and you have a vested interest to solve it, as opposed to somebody else who might not understand the urgency of solving the issue. So a few key points here. A lot of this underrepresentation takes place both on a governmental level, on an institutional level, and then in negotiations as a result. So, for example, COP26, even though there were many policies or I don't know what the word is, but there were statements put out that they were making an effort to increase representation, it still ended up being dominated by white male middle and upper class individuals, and which meant that women, non-binary individuals, and ethnic minorities or people from poor socioeconomic backgrounds were seriously underrepresented. And connected to that is this kind of staggering statistic that, again, women and children are 14 times more likely than men to suffer the direct impacts of natural disasters. So if they are not included in the decision making that's supposed to change things, how would things end up changing? Because again, it's that point of, if you give the same sense of urgency would not be applicable to somebody who's not directly impacted by it. And then these 2 points were things that were raised to me by people who did attend COP26. Particularly regarding accessibility. So the first point that was raised was that COP26 didn't have wheelchair access on certain days. And then the second point was there was a real divide between who was able to speak to the big players of industrial and political leaders, which again, if you separate the two and you don't create a point for ordinary individuals and everyday individuals to speak to the big decision makers, that's going to affect the quality and the success of the outcomes that you want to reach. So again, causes and possible responses to what I've raised already. There is an issue of gender and racial inequality in respective governments as well as institutions. One statistic that kind of goes for this is that 21%, globally, 21% of government ministers are women, which means that the rest of the percentage is men. And consequently, it's not really surprising that in the end, climate delegations would be gender imbalanced. And on that point, the reason for this is because there are generally fewer resources and formal rights that women and non-binary individuals, ethnic minorities have, and in some instances, ethnic groups are actively prevented from joining these formal institutions as well. And then you link it to inaccessible protest methods as well. So in the case of some ethnic minorities are prevented by threats of violence from participating in protest methods, and then for socioeconomic backgrounds, it's not always accessible for everybody to go and participate in a protest because they can't really take off time from work if you belong to a background where you're living from a paycheck, a daily wage earner, for example. And just the general inaccessibility in conferences, in addition to wheelchair access that I discussed before, things such as visa restrictions, and with COVID, there was a lot of restrictions for quarantine requirements, vaccine requirements, and they weren't adequately considered before. And that could potentially be because the people making the decisions and handling logistics weren't representative of the whole lot that would be involved in the conference. So one way to practically then solve that issue is to then hire people with the relevant experience and background, and also people who can actively engage with the community that's going to be involved in conferences or any sort of big climate change discussion, to kind of see what accommodations are necessary for these communities to be involved and have their voices heard. And also, I think decision makers, people who handle logistics of events, should ask the question as to, am I exacerbating the causes that I've listed above? Or am I making sure that they're addressed in a meaningful way to the community? And as I said before, the inequality and underrepresentation really affects the quality and success of outcomes. So these are 4 practical recommendations that I came up with, or like rather my experiences have maybe taught me. So I think the first one is to engage with underrepresented communities in a non-extractive manner. And what I mean by that is taking into consideration that whatever that community says is not to be exoticized, or it doesn't need to come as somebody's own research either. Purely just engaging with the community and accommodating what they're saying in a meaningful way. And a couple of ways to do this would be to have focus groups that are community-based, and then research funds also for community-based organizations, and then feedback forms. And I think one organization that does this in Scotland pretty well is the Ethnic Minority Environment Network, which works on a lot of campaigns and then practical ways to increase ethnic minority commitments to address and raise awareness for climate issues. Another practical recommendation would be to have flat structure classrooms, which is something I've learned about from the TGP, which kind of ensures that everyone's contributions are equally valued, which allows for a more insightful and well-rounded discussion. So taking everybody's contributions as equal, as opposed to a hierarchical structure where what one person says is nothing but the truth, which is not always the case, because people come with a variety of experiences, and to treat everyone's experiences as valuable is very important if you're talking about things like climate justice, especially. And then make an effort to search, include, and engage with research and readings that don't fit the standard. So something that is starting here is the introduction of diverse reading list, but I think that putting a bunch of different authors on a reading list is not enough. There needs to be ways that recommendations for the way that people engage with these resources in tutorials. And that's mainly what this point is about. And this last one is to give value to people's experiences over theories, which might not always be accepted if you're a very traditional academic. But the reason that I think that particular is important is because the way you theorize or the way you conduct academia always has a real impact on the people that you're theorizing. And I think that really people need to recognize that, and it can all have a negative or a positive effect if you do that. For example, if you take an issue like climate migration, there might be a variety of theories that talk about that, but ultimately you need to give equal account to people's experiences, because it's not just something that you're reading about, but it's something that happens on a real practical level. So hearing the stories from that is very important, to hear about these issues from a non-academic, non-theoretical perspective, to hear and recognize from actual people who are, because these issues are not just issues, they are people at the end of the day. So yeah, those are my few recommendations. I'm going to start presenting now.
Thank you so much, Akshika. That was brilliant. I think I keep on saying that was brilliant, but I think all three presentations were really great. I think for me, the themes that really, the theme that at least came up to me through all those presentations was kind of this theory of siding with well, non-academia when we're talking about climate justice, or when we're talking about issues and situations of marginalization and oppression, and how keeping these subjects within kind of academic constraints is in a way confining and de-radicalizing possible solutions. And I really just appreciated how all three of you went through how this information, whether it was theater of the oppressed or fictional as a possible liberatory space, or the logistics of organizing a mega conference like COP, can all be kind of used in a practical sense, more to side with the more radical aspects of addressing climate justice, and thinking about how we can non-academicize like these topics as well. I have questions, but I want to see first if the audience has questions. So if you do have questions, please feel free to raise your hand, or to even just go for it yourself. I'm seeing that, well, Jennifer Baugh from Score Scotland said, I think the point that we need to highlight real life experiences is key. Couldn't agree more. Yes, yeah, definitely a takeaway. Thanks, Jennifer. Hannah, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Akshika's presentation really resonated with me, and I just wanted to share that I've taken this module this semester in IR with, and I think that the professor did an incredibly good job of not just having alternative sources on the reading list, but having really, really high expectations for how we are supposed to engage with them. So not just like, I included a poem, if it makes you feel good, that's nice. But instead she was like, we have analytic skills that we've been developing as students, and I want you to apply it to these sources that aren't necessarily the ones you would feel comfortable engaging with. And so it's a class on politics of nature and place. And so we're reading like poetry about how disabled bodies experience nature differently. and it was such an interesting medium through which to engage with that content. And then I think that it really helped to have such high expectations for what does it mean to critically engage, because I think sometimes that's the issue, is people are like, oh, this is an alternative voice, this is an experience, this is art, and so I'm going to talk about it in a different tone as though it's supposed to either make me feel good or
Thanks for that, Hannah. Any questions from the audience for any of the panelists or for all three? One from Ali. Go for it, Ali.
Okay, sorry, still takes ages to unmute myself. Yeah, I've put it in the chat as well. Just, I mean, thank you for all three presentations. I thought they were just great, and they really made me think about practical things. Just, you know, I was thinking about you know, for the theatre for the press stuff, like, oh, I wonder if, you know, Dundee Rep, you know, we could do something at Dundee Rep, and then I was thinking, Hannah, about actually how useful would it be to have like almost like the sort of climate justice equivalent of Spark notes, you know, like beside a particular book. And I just think as well that, you know, Akshika, just the idea about you know, just how conferences work, and, you know, I was thinking to him just how, you know, that question of who gets to speak, and the fact even that you get, you know, sort of big delegations versus small delegations. And so if you're a big delegation, like from the US or the UK or whatever, but what I wanted to really ask was, how has each of the, and coming from that, how has each of their work, your work, made you think about voices and how voices get heard, and the role of education in driving change with that? Any thoughts?
I think, like, right now, I think that I can only speak from my experience, but I just feel that we don't focus enough on individual voices, and because of the way the voices get heard. So if we hear about a story, it's usually from the perspective of, you know, somebody theorizing it, or it doesn't allow the story of the person to shine in its own light. You kind of bombard it with a bunch of theories and examine it like that, which I'm guilty of because I need marks. But you know, I would really like to see, going forward, just having more people's stories just existing on its own without people putting in a bunch of other stuff to kind of take away from the truth, if that makes any sense. Yeah, I think education has a long way to go in terms of just allowing things to exist in that space without having to put it in a box.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think to build on Akshika's point about thinking really about individual voices and not just groups, I think the research really made me think about why some individuals within groups speak up and why others don't. And it reminds me of some of the discussion we had at the very start of the Emerging Researcher program of, you know, what is a community, who speaks up within a community, and are people who are facing multiple types of oppression less likely to be speaking up than people facing only certain types of oppression. And so I think it was really making me think of, should we encourage everyone to be active? Like, is it a lot of pressure to be putting on someone to say you should speak up? Like, should we even aim to turn everyone into activists, or is it just us putting even more pressure on other people? And yeah, very individually, what I was like thinking of, what elements in your life make you want to speak up? Is it just the way your parents educate you on your self-confidence, or is it, you know, your education? And I guess specifically, it's a really key role that educators can play in encouraging that. But yeah, I think it's still a question I have of what is encouraging people to speak up and what is putting pressure on people to say they have to speak up.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, just going off of that, I think that I confronted my own frustration in conversations about climate justice with this like fetishizing the wound kind of phenomenon where people who are experiencing difficulties of climate change are, first of all, expected to speak always about sadness and always about exclusion and failures and heavy things, and then also that their experience of it is the data, so then they're expected to speak, and then people, and I think that, I mean, for obvious reasons, that has a lot of issues with it, and I think that I have found it helpful to challenge myself to, you know, hold two truths in the same embrace, both that there are stories of connection and love, growth, happiness living alongside these narratives of exclusion and destruction and catastrophe, because I think that it can become a very weary conversation, and it can expect a lot of emotional energy from certain voices and communities to do this work of educating.
Thank you. I mean, because it really does as well think about what that educational space sort of looks like, doesn't it, really, and what, you know, as you said as well, Mathilde, what gets encouraged and what doesn't, you know. I mean, certainly, you know, like in a Scottish context, there was sort of, you know, there's always been quite a discussion, I think less so now, but about how actually you were often meant to just sit there and listen, you know, and that does make things different compared to, you know, if you're in an educational system where you're encouraged to speak, you know, because then using your voice is sort of somewhat less laborious, you know, than if you've not been taught to use it, really. So thank you.
Do you have any, we have time for one more question. Anyone has one? I guess if no one else does, I'll go. But for the panelists, it's just kind of a final remark. I think we talk about voice and narrative, and maybe we've talked about, I mean, all of you have touched on this, but we talk about voice and narrative a lot in the Emerging Researchers Program, but also in the Third Generation Project. I think it's something that we're kind of obsessed with, really. And I guess I'm interested in where you think the role of narrative comes into play practically in combating climate injustice. I know that's quite a big question, but yeah, if you want to take a go at it.
Just to, when you mean like the role of narrative, do you mean like individual stories? Like
I think it can, for me, the wider mechanism, like what the kind of bigger narratives as well as individual ones. Narrative is something we I guess we just talk a lot about, and I guess your first impression of what that means, I'm just curious. Yeah.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I would just say that with narratives, and I think it was Hannah that raised this point about there is a certain narrative when it comes to climate change that people, you know, who are experiencing climate change are constantly suffering, and just it's always put in the what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to make the point that the communities that are suffering can also be the communities with the solutions. And that needs to kind of be a narrative that needs to be displayed more. Like, the people that are suffering aren't just people that suffer. They also have solutions that we can learn from. And that's where I would say that combats injustice. So from a realistic point, you know, of, like, for me, villages back home, the coastal communities, they do suffer from soil erosion and things like that, from sea level rise. But coastal erosion, not soil erosion. But they also don't live the same extractive life that that exacerbates climate change that you might see in industrialized countries. So in that respect, they directly pose both the suffering and the solution. Yeah, so that's something that, if you open your mind to the possibility that people have more than one narrative, and you don't just give people one narrative, that's what you stick with, that can really combat injustice.
I really like that. Thanks.
Yeah, that is such a big question. I guess it was making me think, especially actually speaking as well, about, I guess, what do we make out of this in practice, and how it sometimes feel like, yes, we listen to individual people, but then we make these really broad global theories out of it, and then we try to go back to working with individual people. And I feel, and maybe it's just my job influencing me because we only work with local communities, and everything, like the research and the output, is only centered on the community, and we don't try to make theories as much. And sometimes it feels like, maybe in academic research, we will be doing research with individual small focus groups, small interviews, but then you make this big theory out of, this is how working with individual people works, and you try to apply it elsewhere. And I think there's sometimes too much of a disconnect between the research and the outputs, and sometimes we would benefit from keeping it more local. And yes, it's good to listen to local people, but then, like, work with them more closely for the solution, and not just to make theories out of it. Yeah, I hope that's clear.
Yeah, I really agree with what you just said. And the thing that came to my mind, which I think may on its surface seem like a contradiction, actually goes together with what you said, which is that the theory for me that really helped illuminate the nature, like the kind of like insidious hidden nature of climate change, is like slow violence that Rob Nixon talks about in his book Slow Violence and the Environmentalization of the Poor, something like that, because he recontextualizes violence as, you know, this thing that's normally very in your face, like able to be captured on film, just like short timeline, etc., into something that can be invisible, like coastal erosion, or like rising sea levels, or like ice caps melting, or like acidification of oceans, these things that you can't actually capture and it's difficult to build a narrative around. We precisely need a theory to give it a label so that we can start talking about it in story form. And I think that, but then his book is also focused exactly on small examples of slow violence in these communities he was doing research in. I think this is like an environmental, maybe like a geographer or something. And so I think that, yeah, you can separate this theory from exactly the very small niche community groups that are struggling to advocate for themselves because there's no word to describe the thing that's happening, because people don't know how to care about it yet, because we don't have a story for it.
Oh, thank you, all three of you. I like brilliant presentations, brilliant answers. Like I don't know, I think for me, like the emerging researchers program is probably like my favorite part of TGP, because it's like kind of dealing with all the inadequacies and issues with academia, and talking about kind of yeah, like what Jennifer is describing in the chat is just kind of like real life experiences, and kind of like how academia gets it wrong so often, and kind of its approach, and how we can actually come up with better solutions to doing academia differently. I mean, we're all in this sector, so just trying to humanize it again, or if it ever was humanized as a sector. But anyway, I think we'll take a break at this point.
So hi everybody, let's get started on the second panel, which is titled Educating on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, Sustainability and Extractivism. And we've got two members of the class of 2021 who are going to present on this panel. And I think one of the places that we start really with the Emerging Researchers Programme, one of the key readings is Decolonising Methodologies by Linda Tuiwai Smith, and that is one of these books that really just demonstrates how Indigenous knowledge is, often tokenized within the academy, and used in particular ways, and just how important it is to consider again doing academia differently in this regard. So we've got Ciara Logan, first of all, to kick off, looking at approaches to nature from Indigenous scholars and implications for environmental sustainability. Okay, thanks, Ciara.
Hi. Well, thank you so much, Ali. Sorry, I'm just sharing my screen quickly. So how did people, oh, there you go. Great, is that working for everybody? Can you see that? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Oh no, can you?
Sorry, yeah, not yet. It's still doing something.
Okay, let me.
Okay.
Let's see. Sorry.
Yeah, that's you sharing your screen.
That's working now. Okay, great.
Yeah, it's not. It's still the screen that's got me on it, so it's not got the. My one's got me on it, not.
Oh, here we go. I think that was my fault. Sorry, but hopefully that works then. Okay. Great. So I'm going to be talking.
Ciara, so we can essentially see your team's screen.
Oh, is that it? Oh goodness. Okay. Sorry. I think. I'm sorry. Let me try this one more time. So I'm like struggling.
I
think if I do like that. So I'm trying to press the window, but it's not like showing the. I'll try this one more time. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, glad I got that worked. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about approaches to nature from Indigenous scholars, and sort of how we can see implications for our own environmental sustainability in a broader context. So this will be sort of informed by three primary Indigenous scholars, and I see this as not taking a hegemonic approach towards what Indigenous approaches to nature are, but rather seeing different approaches from scholars and activists from different nations in the Indigenous communities, and seeing how these can apply towards contemporary approaches towards climate change. So the main people we'll be looking at are both scholars and activists. So there is Robin Wall Kammerer, who her work really sort of inspired this project from the first place. So she's a member of the Potawatomi Nation, and she combines Western and Indigenous approaches to botany. So she's a botanist in a Western sense, but also she sees her own raising her own childhood as growing up in a Potawatomi family and having the very traditional approaches to nature as very much informing her approach to botany and to land and the environment in general. Also, I'll be drawing upon the work of Leanne Simpson, and as she understands non-Western approaches towards land. And then finally, drawing upon work from Sandy Grand, who's a member of the Quechua Nation, as she problematizes understanding land as a commodity, like a transactional commodity. So I really like this quote from Khmer, where she says she advocates for a reality in which the relationship between land and the self, between the self and the world, is reciprocal. So she has this wonderful thing in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about the role of maple trees in the Potawatomi Nation, in the land that is the Potawatomi Nation, and sometimes even called the Maple Nation. And they treat trees as people. And I think this really heads towards this idea of treating nature with respect and giving back to nature. And they really treat the trees as people and with respect as you would treat a person. So, not over harvesting the maple trees for syrup, really this reciprocal relationship, and realizing that as humans treat nature kindly and with respect and don't exploit it without and don't exploit it to an excessive extent, that nature will in return provide for people. And they realize that once you start, for example, a metaphor she uses is that as you tap into a maple tree too much for syrup, it will eventually just die off and stop giving you syrup at all. Whereas if you, are a bit more reasonable in what you expect of it and you don't exploit the tree, it will actually end up providing more in the long term. So it really hits this reciprocal relationship between humans and land. I think this has a lot of applications for climate change today, as we're in a world where we're building pipelines. We understand land more as a human commodity, where the purpose of land is to help humans and help civilization thrive. And while land certainly can do that, can provide for humans and can provide for civilization, it's important that we're also giving back the same amount, if not more, back to the land. So that gets into initiatives like rewilding initiatives, or just reasonable, sustainable approaches towards alternative forms of energy, anything that will treat land with due dignity and respect, almost as much as you would treat a person, is a really fascinating concept that arises in Khmer's book and in her scholarship. So secondly, I'll look at Leanne Simpson, how she is a member of the Ojibwe Nation, and she uses a term in her native language called aki, which is the term for land, but it has these connotations of place, power, relation. So it's really the opposite of understanding land as commodity or capital in a traditional Western sense. And so by place, power, relation, I understand that as her concept of aki will encourage individuals and communities to look towards land as sources of meaning and identity. So really seeing how communities can be rooted in their connection to land. And this applies both to various Indigenous nations, but can also apply towards non-First Nation people around the world, seeing land as part of identity and being really rooted in place. And that will encourage, more of a communal approach to land and not viewing land as this entity to be exploited for personal gain. So thirdly, I'll look at work from Sandy Grant. So she refuses the Western concept of land as cultivated land and as alienable private property. So this suggests that land is ultimately impacting humans as a collective, and so treating land as relating to humans as a collective really can lead to more beneficial relationships with nature in general. So this is understanding that land needs to be nurtured outside of the confines of understanding it as alienable private property. And this will encourage humanity towards more of an understanding that will contribute towards lessening climate change in terms of understanding that land impacts the community as a collective. So that will that puts in a emphasis on future generations and really looking at land as impacting everybody. So we don't view short-term gains as preferable, even if they might hurt generations in the long term. So namely, I'm looking at anything that contributes to greenhouse gases or climate change in general. So some more concrete takeaways to take from this can be rooted in Jody Bird's understanding of colonial nations as having histories of what they call indigenous replacement, which is basically just when Jody Bird says that, they're more referring to indigenous histories of indigenous people being displaced from their lands. But this can also be applied to the idea of the displacement of indigenous approaches, intellectual approaches, and traditions towards nature with Western approaches. And by sort of undoing this displacement and really centering indigenous approaches towards land and nature, we can work towards combating climate change. And so again, some more finite ways of looking at that. So from these indigenous scholars, we can see the idea of land as ultimately affecting and belonging to communities as a whole. So that will discourage relationships such as unmanaged oil and natural gas extraction that contribute towards climate change. And this idea of reciprocity between humanity and nature sustains practices such as sustainable agriculture, both in terms of livestock and plants, and also rewilding initiatives, and then responsible approaches towards alternative energy resources. And finally, really what I see this all boiling down to is looking towards both historic and ongoing indigenous practices of relating to nature, not looking at indigenous practices as a monolith, but looking at different practices from different scholars and activists in various indigenous communities and seeing how these can be implemented in modern, broader approaches towards the environment and ending climate change. So yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, Kira, is that you? Sorry, my network.
Oh yeah, that's me done. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, and thank you. It's really fascinating to talk about, land and place and belonging, because it does link as well into into what we the discussions of home and things, I think, as well. I think as well, I mean, I was sort of reminded, when you're talking almost about that disconnect between I'm not asking a question, I'm just sort of, I know there's going to be questions, it's just while it's in my head, that disconnect between like almost sort of policy and land and how that's viewed, because it makes me think about academia and education as well, because I don't know if you've ever seen that YouTube clip of the TED talk by Ken Robinson, and he talks about how educators use their bodies as a means of transport for their heads, and that's basically all, not any sort of embodiment. So it's really interesting. Thank you so much. There will be questions and things after. For now then, can I turn to Jenny and Jenny's presentation on extractive industry, man camps and Indigenous gender-based violence in Western Canada. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ali. I'll also just share my screen, hopefully. Can you see that?
Yep, that works.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, my project looks at how the so-called extractive industry man camps are linked with Indigenous gender-based violence. And this is explored in the context of Western Canada. However, many of the issues raised are applicable to other places as well. And the reason why I picked this topic was I feel like in the current state of education, often these issues are viewed separately and that these connections aren't really made. But as this presentation will show, it is actually very important to think about how all these different issues do intersect with each other. So man camps are temporary housing communities which were built to house the largely male workforce working for the oil and gas industry. And many of these camps are on or are near resource-rich Indigenous territories. And as I said earlier, the project's important because although environmental violence and gender-based violence are two of the most pressing issues facing humanity, existing policy and education addresses these issues separately. However, Indigenous women in particular are situated at the centre of both of the issues, and therefore it's essential to understand how they interact. So you can't consider the gendered consequences of extractive violence without looking at the larger structure of settler colonialism in Canada. And so before European colonisation, many Indigenous nations had fluid gender relations, and women were central to the governance of Indigenous nations and were key teachers and holders of Indigenous knowledge. Therefore, in order to gain access to the land, European colonisers who settled on the Indigenous territory that is now referred to as Canada, they targeted Indigenous women through physical violence, but also sexual violence, and through sexist Indian Act legislation, and through imposing very patriarchal gender binaries on these communities. And Indigenous women still face disproportionate levels of violence today, and they are 12 times more likely to be murdered or missing than any other women in Canada. So following on from this historical context, I would like to explain how these man camps are linked with extractive industries. And so these camps often have high concentrations of money and drugs as well as isolation, and this fosters a very hyper-masculine culture, which leads to increased rates of violence against Indigenous women in neighbouring communities. And this includes sexual assault and sex trafficking, among other issues. And this has occurred throughout history with elevated rates of Indigenous rape during the Gold Rush period. And also in 2009, the tar sands region of Canada had the highest national domestic violence rate in Canada. And so these camps significantly increase the population of remote areas, which can overburden services, so health services, but also police services, which can create an atmosphere of lawlessness and often means that Indigenous women don't receive justice. Additionally, the introduction of industrial employment into Indigenous communities often favours men over women, which can increase the economic dependence of women on men, which again can lead to increased violence. So it's important to highlight that these man camps and the extractive industries have been resisted by Indigenous communities, which show that they shouldn't be framed solely as victims. So one example of this is the Tiny House Warriors, who are a group of Indigenous Secwepemc land defenders, and they're building 10 tiny houses along the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion route to prevent the pipeline and associated mine camps from being built. So half of the pipeline route passes through unceded Secwepemc territory, but they have not consented to this pipeline being built. And so by building these houses, they're simultaneously asserting sovereignty over their land, but also addressing their nation's housing crisis. So in 2018, they built 6 houses on wheels to block the construction of an 1,000-worker man camp at Blue River in British Columbia. And the village was attacked in the evening of the 19th of April 2020 by 4 people who drove over the signs, the entry signs to the village, and also tore down red dresses which memorialised Indigenous women, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2 spirited people. And they also drove into a few of the houses with trucks. Additionally, the Tiny House Warriors have been criminalised a lot by the Canadian police by refusing to obey trespass notices. And this has led them, and consequently they have lots of, they have large legal fines that they're trying to pay. So I'll next discuss how the health and well-being of Indigenous communities is being further impacted by the current pandemic. So the extractive projects in northern British Columbia were deemed essential services by the province during COVID and have remained open throughout the entire pandemic alongside the associated man camps. And the camp's transient workforce, who alternate between working in the camp and going home every few weeks, as well as the cramped conditions in the camps, has meant that there's been many COVID-19 outbreaks. And And this is an issue because many of the camp staff are, such as the cleaners and the cooks, are from the neighbouring Indigenous communities, and they were not given adequate protection, which led to the spread of COVID-19 into these Indigenous communities. And this is really concerning because elders, who are often the people who hold a lot of valuable language knowledge and cultural knowledge, are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 because of their age. So overall, the pandemic has facilitated pipeline advancement because, as the Alberta Energy Minister said, now is a great time to be building a pipeline because you can't have protests of more than 15 people. And the decision to keep the extracted projects open during the pandemic is a clear example of a government prioritising profit over lives. So in summary, this project explored the intersections of racism and patriarchy and extractivism within settler colonialism. And the research could be interesting for educators who need like a short summary of this issue in order to teach like how and why extractive industries cause more than just damage to the environment, and to emphasize the racialized and gendered consequences of the industry, and to broaden discussions of climate change towards climate justice. And just like I have done in this presentation, it could be useful to develop educational resources that first talk about the historical context before introducing the contemporary issues. And it's really important to emphasize that the extractive industries are being resisted by Indigenous communities. And there's a lot of resources discussing this online, which I find very helpful. So thanks very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Jenny. And I think you're really right, because so often, you know, it's about trying to get across that, you know, like gender justice is climate justice, is sexuality justice, you know, is, racial justice. And, you know, and it's quite difficult sometimes to just conceptually do that. So I think having concrete examples is a really good way in. Could I have some questions, please? We've got about 9 minutes of the allocated time left. Any questions? Either write them in the chat or go ahead or put your hand up, whichever you'd like. Any questions? Okay, so from Bennett, how do we uplift Indigenous voices, stories and knowledges without appropriating or tokenising them?
That's a really good question. Definitely a big one, but in order, I think something that is good to keep in mind as we get started answering a question like this is taking Indigenous approaches towards whatever it is that we're looking at, not as a monolith, but in terms of recognizing the differences both not just according to different nations, but also just different individuals, and not treating Indigenous approaches as a monolith, which I think could be a form of exoticizing them or tokenizing them. So, and then just constantly referencing back to Indigenous people when we are taking ideas from them and drawing upon ideas from them, making sure constantly consulting with them in the process that we are really saying this in the way that they want it to be said, and as much as possible letting them speak for themselves, and not, you know, as academics or as activists speaking for them. And so really involving Indigenous people at every step of the process.
Okay, thank you. Jenny.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. And I think part of the challenge is enabling people to speak for themselves in these kind of spaces. But I think I find this in my own research as part of my degree as well, that sometimes it is very hard to include those voices directly, but then even if you're trying to include those voices indirectly through using like quotes and actually like statements that people have made, rather than trying to summarize that and putting your own spin on it. And it kind of goes back to what I think it was Akshika who said earlier, that so much academia and policy, like we don't just let voices speak for themselves, like we're always interpreting them through like fancy theories and stuff and those kind of frameworks, so that just presenting these voices and presenting those different perspectives are really important.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? We've got 5 minutes or so. Anyone else?
Can I just ask, like, oh, sorry. My one was just going to be like, if people have any resources that they would recommend in terms of like books that really center around experiences, just to maybe put them in the chat. Or I can actually put my email as well, if you could email those to me, because I know that a lot of the emerging researchers have done a lot of research and stuff, so I'd love to know anything that people recommend.
Okay.
Yeah, which I mentioned in my presentation is Raiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kammerer. So she talks about her own experiences both in childhood and now as a mother, and as a scholar at a Western academic institution, about her approaches to nature, both from a Western perspective, from like a botany, hard science standpoint, and also from her Potawatomi upbringing. So I think that's a really fascinating one. I always recommend it. So that's definitely one. I think there's also a hand raised from Jennifer.
Yeah, Jennifer.
Hi. So unfortunately, it's not really a question. I suppose it's more of a comment. Thank you so much for everyone who's presented today. I found it so interesting. I work for, we're a grassroots organisation in Westerhales in Edinburgh, and we support Black and minority ethnic communities. And we also do quite a lot of work in terms of climate change and climate justice. And definitely, I suppose it's more of a difficulty we've had with engaging with research, because we would love to be able to engage. But what we found is sometimes we get maybe an email from a student or a group of students, or it might be a phone call saying, we'd like to ask you some questions, but we need your response in a day or two. And for us, it's really difficult because obviously we want to support the student's experience and make sure we're able to provide that information that we get from our service users, but often it's done without a lot of acknowledgement about like the context of our work, and also just we have so many different funding stipulations as well, and staffing and all those kind of issues. So just to say, so it's not really a question, it's maybe just more a comment that I think for students it's probably quite useful if you're engaging with local services, just to think that side of things through with third sector organisations.
Thanks, Jennifer. I mean, it's a really good point, because I think as well, just it sort of shows as well how, so often in universities, it's that sort of hierarchy thing of thinking about, like their own sort of timetables and not thinking about other people's timetables. So they're sort of running to an academic one and thinking, well, I need this by X.
Yeah.
And not actually really recognising what, the sort of working conditions that other folk are working with, So I think it's a really good point. And a really good point as part of the methodology as a whole, just like a practical thing, like for people not to do, so thank you. Any other questions? We've got a few minutes left. Can I actually, as well, just while anybody's sort of thinking, can I just ask quite a cheeky question, which is actually, because both of the presentations are working, with questions of Indigenous scholarship, Indigenous communities. What did you maybe? Was there any thoughts that you had on listening to each other's presentations about the work that you've done already?
Yeah, I really found interesting how I really admire, maybe less over this, but more. I just talked a little bit with Jenny about her dissertation. I think it's really amazing how she is actually in direct contact with Indigenous communities in Canada. I think that really shows how she's really prioritizing Indigenous voices and making sure that, they speak for themselves in every step of the research process. So I find that really fascinating. And I think you can definitely see that approach towards knowledge applied in her presentation.
Yeah, no, I definitely, I mean, I know me and Kira have had discussions just sort of informally about like the challenges of both our topics are obviously very communities and how, sorry, I think I froze. But it's yeah, like especially like from Kira's perspective, like thinking about how to increase those voices within those kind of those spaces and those decision-making spaces, it is quite a challenge not to sort of speak for these people, especially when you don't always have access to them. And so like we have talked about the challenges of that, and I think we've both just agreed that like you just need to be reflective like throughout the process of doing that and always be conscious of what you're doing. And even if you think that you're doing something that's like, even if you think you're doing something which is going to help, like be really critical about the fact of like, who are you, where are you coming from? And, just because you think you can help somebody or raise somebody's voice, like really considering whether they want that or whether, you actually can help, and I guess just negotiating those questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? No. In which case, I'm going to say a final thank you to both of you and to then hand over to Bennett for closing comments.
Yeah, I don't have anything grandiose really to say other than I think I would just like to give like a virtual round of applause for the 5 presenters today. I think all the projects just goes to show how impressive all of these individuals are. And I mean, it's been a pleasure working with them for, it's been now, well, several years for some of them. But I think another nice thing about the Emerging Researchers program is that we like our emerging researchers to stay in touch and to be part of kind of this growing community that's surrounding the 3rd Generation project, and to be involved hopefully in educating future emerging researchers. And yeah, I think from the themes today of questioning what knowledges and voices get prioritized in the wider fight against climate injustice. Those are really important questions to ask, and I think all 5 presentations really touched on how much thought has to go into this and into our actions as we try to claim to fight for climate justice in radical ways. If we are to really to exit the privilege of academia and work with people that are on the front lines. And I think that final point from Jennifer about how to interact with organizations who are doing the work from an academic standpoint just goes to show that academics and people in spaces of academia, as much as we think and have access to all of these institutions of knowledge, that we just get it wrong so often and so wrong sometimes. And really, it just takes listening and active listening to try to get it right. And that is something we really try to bring home with the Emerging Researchers program. But that being said, we're always receptive to critique and feedback. So if there is something today that I feel like that maybe you feel like you would have liked to hear more about, or you saw as perhaps like a red flag that you think something should be talked about more within the Emerging Researchers program, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'll put we'll put the email in the chat, but thank you all for coming out today and to this first exhibition of emerging researchers projects. And this will certainly not be the last, but this is officially this round of emerging researchers graduated from the program, so they're now official alumni. So yeah, congratulations to you all. And yeah, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your weekend. And thanks again for coming out.